Before we get started with today's video, I want to start off by saying that I love the remakes. I even enjoy Resident Evil 3 Remake to a certain extent. With that being said, nothing is perfect. Whenever a developer attempts to remake a classic that is adored by a very passionate fan base, not every decision that they make is a positive one. More specifically, it's when the teams behind remaking these classics decide to get a little creative with the source material and change things up that it could be received differently depending on the changes. Sometimes they are for the better. Other times, well, that's what this video is about. From the 2002 remake of the first game to the most recent entry, Resident Evil 4 Remake, today's video will focus on the worst changes seen in the remakes of the series. Whether that be in the form of cut locations, new backstories for iconic characters, or even the removal of certain gameplay mechanics, these changes were definitely not for the better. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 10 worst changes in the Resident Evil remakes. Let's get it. Number 10, Jill Sandwich, Resident Evil Remake.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
For the most part, the 2002 remake of the original game is without a doubt more loyal to the source material compared to every other remake of the franchise. For that reason, you'll notice that it doesn't really have many things missing or changed from the original game. However, there are two things I can think of, one of which refers to the most iconic line from the original game. Yep, that's right, no Jill sandwich in the remake. Which is kind of crazy to think about since this line is probably one of the most iconic lines from the original game. It's clear that the 2002 remake tries to take things more seriously compared to its predecessor. This is why most of the cringy lines from the original game have been replaced with more casual dialogue between characters. While I totally understand changing most of the dialogue in the remake to be a little more serious and darker than the original game, I don't think it would have made that much of a difference to at least keep the iconic Jill sandwich quote, considering Barry still makes a joke about the situation anyway. Instead, we get this boring variation of one of the most famous quotes from the first game.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Number 9, Spiders, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 remakes. After replaying both RE2 Remake and RE3 Remake recently, I've realized something. Capcom hates spiders. I don't know why or the reason for it, but every encounter with a giant spider was completely cut from the remakes. In Resident Evil 2, the spiders were supposed to pop up in the sewers. It was a small section with only a few of them in the game, but it would have been great seeing them on the RE engine. Then when Resident Evil 3 Remake released, the giant spiders were once again cut from the game. This time they were supposed to appear in the clock tower, which ironically was also cut from the game. Maybe for whatever reason, the giant spiders don't mesh well with the RE engine, but either way, it was a small disappointment to see them not included in either remake. Number 8, Alternate Scenes, Resident Evil Remake. As I said earlier, there's not many things that the 2002 remake changed or removed completely. In fact, they mostly added things like Lisa Trevor and the Crimson Heads. However, there was one more significant negative change to the 2002 remake. In the original game, there were more alternate scenes based on multiple factors. For example, in Jill's scenario, you could meet Barry in multiple different rooms, but meeting him in one situation would cancel out another. Now, there were elements of this kept for the remake, like how Barry would only save Jill from becoming a Jill sandwich only if the player went to this room before meeting Barry elsewhere in the mansion. However, there were multiple situations like this, more so in the original game than in the remake. Also, in the original game, there are two situations that could cause Barry to die compared to the remake, both of which seem like a minor decision until you find Barry's body later on in the game. In the remake, you're simply presented with either giving his gun back or not giving his gun back before Lisa Trevor's boss fight. But in the original game, Barry will die if Jill chooses not to wait for Barry to return with more rope after the second Yawn fight, and he will also die if Jill tells Barry to lead the way when exploring the tunnels later in the game. Chris and Rebecca's alternate routes have been removed too, although there's not as many unique scenes as Jill and Barry had. In the Chris scenario, unlike the remake, your first meeting with Rebecca can actually be in one of two different locations. Either with Richard, like the remake, or in a room where you find the antidote for Richard. Whichever room you find yourself in first will decide where you meet her first and will influence other elements of the game. For example, where and if the hunter attacks Rebecca will depend on situations involving where you met her and how long it took you to get the antidote for Richard. While Jill's scenario received the most cut content in terms of the alternate routes in the remake, both scenarios were ultimately affected by this change, and unfortunately, it did remove some replayability of the remake compared to the original game. Still, the remake remains the definitive way to play the original Nightmare in my opinion, thanks to the new content outweighing the removed content of the game. Number 7. Zapping System, Resident Evil 2 Remake. One of the more interesting features in Resident Evil 2 was the zapping system. It was a really small feature that was never used again in other entries, despite it being a pretty fun way to create replayability. In the original Resident Evil 2, there were a total of 9 circumstances affected by the zapping system. What this means is that decisions made in Scenario A would affect certain elements of Scenario B. Perhaps the most notable example of the zapping system was the decision to take either the side pack or the machine gun in Scenario A. Whichever item you left behind could then be picked up by the playable character of Scenario B. Another example was using a poisonous gas in the lab to weaken the enemies in Scenario A, but this will then make those same enemies poisonous in Scenario B. However, my favorite was gaining access to an exclusive room in Scenario B only if the character in both scenarios completed a side quest in which they needed to register their fingerprints and use them to unlock the door for Scenario B's character. In the remake, outside of killing Marvin or leaving him alive, the zapping system was completely removed from the game. While this feature was never that big to begin with, it did add some replayability to the game while also creating interesting choices for the player to make when dealing with the monsters of Resident Evil 2 in both scenarios of the game. In fact, like the 2002 remake did before it, RE2 Remake could have expanded on things by exploring the zapping system in a much more creative and interesting way than it was done in the original game. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Instead, we lose every element of the zapping system and its existence in the remake. Number 6. Branching Narratives, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Like the 2002 remake of the original Nightmare, RE3 Remake also chose to remove branching narratives from the main story of the game. However, RE3 actually did it completely, whereas the 2002 remake only did it partly. And it was more frustrating to see it removed from this game compared to the original due to branching narratives playing a much more vital part of the original RE3. That's because giving the player the freedom to choose how they dealt with certain situations was actually front and center in the original RE3 compared to the rest of the franchise. See in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, starting from the first encounter with Nemesis in front of the RPD station, a new mechanic was introduced to the player that would give them 2 options to choose from. This feature would be known as live selection. During a live selection moment in the game, time will freeze as the player must choose which option of 2 options they prefer. For example, in the first live selection of the game, the player could choose to face Nemesis head-on or escape him by running into the RPD station. Some decisions don't change the overall story, but most of them actually lead to unique scenes and encounters that can only be seen if the player makes certain choices throughout the game. For example, certain decisions made in the game could lead to an ending where Barry saves Jill and Carlos at the end of the game. Another awesome change is the death of Murphy Seeker. In the original game, you could have one of 2 endings for this character. Either you'll find Carlos killing a zombified Murphy after begging to be killed, or you'll find a scene that is similar to the remake where Nikolai kills him before he changes. There are other alternate scenes based on the decisions made throughout the game as well, including Nikolai either being killed by Nemesis, blown up by Jill, or even surviving the game completely. Branching narratives was a major part of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis that added a ton of replayability, but it was sadly cut from the remake, which was one of many complaints fans had about the RE3 remake. Number 5. Ada Wong, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Before saying anything about Ada in RE4 Remake, I want to say that I in no way support any of the hateful attacks on the actress. So if you're hoping I'm going to tear her apart, then I suggest you look elsewhere. Instead, my main issue with the change in Ada's portrayal in Resident Evil 4 comes from the massive change in her character as a whole. In the original Resident Evil 4 and just about every other iteration of Ada, she's always been depicted as an anti-hero. Basically, up until this point, she's been a character who's always put the mission first, her survival second, and her conscience third. And while Leon has always had a special place in her heart to the point where she'll often betray her superiors and her mission in order to help or protect Leon, she almost always ends up betraying Leon and partly uses him to achieve her own goals. In Resident Evil 4 Remake, this is the case as well. However, it seems that the character of Ada has more of a conscience than she did in the original game. While she was in fact working for Wesker to obtain a sample of the parasite in the original game, she was also working as a double agent to retrieve the sample for a second organization. Basically, she was using Wesker to achieve her own mission with a different company. Still, she was completely aware of the dangers that the sample would have on the world from the start of her mission. Yet, she still chose to deliver that sample to her company despite how many people would be put in danger. She did a similar thing in Resident Evil 2 Remake and the OG of Resident Evil 2 when she went after the G virus. Essentially, Ada has always put the mission first despite what the ramifications and consequences were of these organizations having these samples. However, in the remake of RE4, they attempted to make Ada a good person. Instead of her typical anti-hero persona, Resident Evil 4 Remake instead turns Ada into a good character who is unaware of what this sample could do in the wrong hands until the end of the game. Unfortunately, this creates two poor traits for the new Ada in my opinion. It makes her less intelligent and makes her less deceitful than the Ada that we've always known. She's now apparently unable to recognize the dangers of the sample in the wrong hands until Wesker outright spells it out for her at the end of the game. Also, RE4 removes the double agent aspect of her backstory, making her less deceitful and mysterious than she was in the original game. Not knowing whose side Ada was actually on and her willingness to portray Wesker, Krauser, and Leon from the get-go was one of the more interesting plot points of the original game. Number 4. A and B scenarios, Resident Evil 2 Remake. We talked about the fact that RE1 had alternate routes based on decisions made by the player, and how RE3 had the live selection feature. Both provided more replayability to their respective games, but Resident Evil 2's A and B scenario system probably added more replayability than either of those two features. See, like the original game, Resident Evil 2 featured two playable characters. The player could choose to play as Leon or Claire first. However, after beating the game, the player could then play Scenario B, which would then follow the events of the game from the perspective of the second character. Now, technically, we got that in the remake in the form of first run and second run. However, in the remake, there were minor differences between the runs, and the changes were mainly exclusive to the characters themselves. But in the original game, both the characters and the scenarios would provide exclusive scenes for each character within each scenario. This basically motivated the players to play the game 4 times, whereas the remake you could be satisfied with just 2 playthroughs, one for each character regardless of the order. To explain this farther, let's dive into some examples. One of the most notable differences is the death of Ada Wong. In Scenario A of Leon's story, Ada falls after being shot by Annette Birkin. In Scenario B, however, Ada dies from being attacked by Mr. X, in which she gives Leon a goodbye kiss. It's 2 completely different scenes that can only be explored if you play as Leon in both Scenario A and Scenario B. Another major example of this is meeting with Kendo at the beginning of the game. In the remake, only Leon meets Kendo. However, in the original game, the character in Scenario A meets Kendo regardless of who they are, and Kendo talks to them differently depending on which character he's addressing. There are other examples of this scattered throughout Resident Evil 2, whereas the only real differences between the order that you play the remake in are some of the puzzles, the interaction with Marvin, and when and where Mr. X first appears. Number 3, Jack Krauser, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Resident Evil 4 Remake changed a lot of things regarding character backgrounds and motivations for multiple characters of the game. Some were positive. For example, Luis has probably the best improvement in terms of his background. However, others were less than positive. Obviously, we covered the change in Ada already, but there was one other character that I felt like lost a lot of interesting traits in the remake. Enter Jack Krauser. Now, before I continue on, I should say that not every change made to Jack Krauser's character was a negative one. For example, I actually liked that Krauser was the one to kill Luis. It provided more hatred and anger for Leon towards Krauser leading up to the final fight against him. However, there were a lot of his background and motivations changed for the remake that, in my opinion, were less interesting. First off, Operation Javier was probably the most frustrating change. In the original game, Leon and Krauser worked together during Operation Javier, and it was actually during this operation that Krauser recognized the power of BOWs and wanted that power for himself. However, in the remake, Leon was apparently never there, and instead Krauser and his team were left for dead by the government, which led to him joining Sadler in search of power. The original game also had Krauser connected to Albert Wesker himself, in which Krauser took the Veronica virus, obtained by Wesker from samples of Steve, Burnside, and Code Veronica, and then he was sent to infiltrate Sadler's cult by Wesker in order to obtain the sample of the Las Plagas. Eventually, Krauser saw the power of the Las Plagas for himself and took a dominant Las Plagas sample for himself to gain even more power. Most of this storyline was removed from the remake though. In the remake, Krauser's connection to Leon is from training him. Only Krauser was a part of Operation Javier, and he never had any contact with Wesker. Instead, he went directly to Sadler for power, in which Sadler gave him in exchange for kidnapping Ashley, the president's daughter. Because of this, so many interesting interactions and backstory regarding Krauser were removed from the remake. We don't get the bickering between Krauser and Ada, as both were hired by Wesker and neither trusted each other. Since the remake only had Ada hired by Wesker, Krauser's interactions with Ada were completely removed, among other elements of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Number 2, cut locations, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Originally, I was going to have each location have a different spot on today's list. But if I did that, then like 80% of this list would have been from RE3 Remake. So instead, I included every cut location of RE3 as a single entry. Outside of one other feature that we'll talk about next, the cut locations of RE3 was easily one of the biggest complaints of the remake. Whereas most Resident Evil remakes attempted to add new locations, RE3 Remake went the opposite route by removing iconic areas of the game. These areas included the Raccoon City Park, which featured a boss fight against the Gravedigger, a newspaper office, a gas station, and a few other locations. However, probably the biggest complaint in terms of locations cut from the game is the clock tower. While seen briefly during a boss fight against Nemesis in the remake, this iconic location was cut from the remake. In the original game, this area would serve as a very important location. Firstly, some of the best and most difficult puzzles were within the clock tower. Jill would also recover in this location from being infected by Nemesis, and the player would explore more of the clock tower as Carlos. There were giant spiders in the clock tower, which, as we covered earlier, were cut from both RE2 and RE3 remakes as well. Hell, there was even a boss fight in which Carlos would fight Nemesis in the clock tower. Not to mention, the design of the clock tower would also be a throwback to Resident Evil 1, as you'll notice similarities between the inside of the clock tower and the Spencer Mansion. Overall, it was a damn shame that Capcom chose to cut so many locations from RE3 Remake, whereas every other remake chose to add new locations. However, the biggest tragedy was the removal of an iconic location like the clock tower. Number 1, Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Remake. While a lot of fans were understandably upset with the missing clock tower and other locations from the original game, it was Nemesis that really stuck out as the worst change in RE3 Remake. Sure, Nemesis was always scripted, even in the original game. However, the remake kind of took a lot of the scare factor and the threat level of Nemesis popping up and threw it completely out the window. In the remake, Nemesis mostly appeared in cutscenes that led to boss fights. What's worse though is that Nemesis never fully felt like a stalker enemy in the remake. Actually, outside of a small section of the game, Nemesis never really chased the player down through multiple areas. Most of the time he popped up was during a mandatory boss fight. And considering that Resident Evil 2 came out a year prior, in which we saw a truly terrifying stalker enemy at work in the form of Mr. X, in comparison, Nemesis was a massive disappointment, especially since this was considered the granddaddy of stalker enemies in horror games back in the day. In the original game, Nemesis felt more intimidating, and he would stalk the player in multiple areas in which he felt more like a stalker enemy than he did in the remake. He would come through random doors and yell his iconic STARS line as he bolted towards Jill. Yeah, we got a small sample of that in the remake, but nowhere near the amount of time we spent with him in the original game. The guy was constantly chasing us throughout every single setting of the game until his final mutation. RE3 Remake dropped the ball drastically on that, and for that reason, Nemesis went from the best stalker enemy in video games to one of the worst stalker enemies of the series in the remake. Even Jack Baker and Lady D outshined this dude. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Was Nemesis the worst change in the remakes of Resident Evil, or do you think something else deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. And don't forget to leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.